The graphite point of the pencil snapped with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the second-period classroom. It was a sharp, distinct crack that severed the fragile concentration hanging over the room like a fog. Down at the desk, the yellow wood splintered against the white page, leaving a jagged black scar across the equation that refused to resolve itself. For Maya, this was not merely a broken writing utensil. It was a physical manifestation of the fracture happening inside her own mind. The air conditioning unit hummed a low, monotonous drone that seemed to vibrate against her temples, keeping time with the rapid, shallow thudding of her heart. She stared at the quadratic formula written on the whiteboard, but the variables and constants had ceased to be numbers. They had twisted into hieroglyphs, into gatekeepers standing with crossed arms, denying her entry into the world of logic and understanding. The frustration rising in her chest was hot and suffocating, a familiar tide that she had learned to recognize but never quite learned to control. This was the precipice of the spiral. It starts with a variable that does not cancel out. It shifts to a panic that blurs the vision. And it ends, inevitably, with the crushing weight of confirming a stereotype she spent every waking hour trying to outrun. To the casual observer, perhaps to the student sitting 2 rows over breezing through the assignment with infuriating ease, this was just math. It was just a sequence of logical steps to determine the value of x. But for Maya, and for so many who share her specific visibility in spaces not originally built for them, the stakes were inextricably higher. This is the phenomenon often whispered about but rarely articulated in the stark fluorescent light of a public school classroom. It is the black tax. It is the psychological surcharge levied on every action, every mistake, and every silence. If the student next to her failed to solve the equation, he was simply a student who needed to study more. If Maya failed, the narrative whispered by history and perceived through the lens of media suggested she was inherently less capable. The equation was not just asking for a numerical answer. It was asking her to justify her presence in this advanced placement track. It was asking her to prove that she belonged in the room. The burden of representation sat on her shoulders, heavy as lead, turning a simple algebraic hurdle into a referendum on her intelligence and her future. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly. She unclenched her fingers from the broken pencil, watching the wood dust settle on the paper. The rest of the class was a blur of motion. Pages turning. Calculators clacking. The soft murmur of confident whispers exchanging answers. She felt an island forming around her desk, a profound isolation that separates the struggling from the successful. It is a lonely place, the landscape of confusion. It is where imposter syndrome takes root and flourishes. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, trying to reset her brain, trying to force the panic back down into the dark corners where she kept her insecurities. But when she opened them, the numbers remained stubborn. The coefficients mocked her. She felt the sting of tears prickling the corners of her eyes, the ultimate betrayal of her composure. To cry here, in front of everyone, would be the final defeat. It would be the surrender to the narrative of weakness. She bit the inside of her cheek, using the sharp pain to ground herself, to stay in the room, to keep fighting a battle that felt increasingly lost. The teacher, Mr. Davis, was moving through the aisles. He was a presence before he was a person seen. You could hear the rhythm of his shoes on the linoleum, a slow, deliberate cadence that commanded respect without demanding it. He did not prowl like a warden looking for infractions. He moved like a gardener inspecting his rows, looking for signs of wilt, for leaves curling at the edges. Maya stiffened as the footsteps grew louder. The instinctive reaction was to cover the paper, to hide the evidence of her failure, to pretend she was deep in thought rather than deep in trouble. This is the defense mechanism of the scrutinized. Hide the struggle. Present the facade of competence even when the foundation is crumbling. If he saw the blank page, if he saw the jagged line of the broken pencil, he would know. He would know she wasn't smart enough. He would suggest she move down a level. He would offer that pitiful, condescending smile that says, "I know this is hard for you." She braced herself for the impact of his pity. She prepared her face, smoothing out the furrowed brow, ready to look up and lie, to say she was just thinking, that she was fine, that she didn't need help. But Mr. Davis did not pass by. The footsteps stopped. The shadow fell across her desk, blocking out the harsh glare of the overhead lights. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with expectation. Maya did not look up immediately. She stared at the polished tips of his shoes, waiting for the reprimand. Waiting for the question of why she hadn't progressed past problem number 3. Instead, she heard the sound of a chair being pulled up. Not the teacher's commanding desk chair, but the empty student chair from the desk beside her. He sat down. He lowered himself to her eye level. This simple physical act disrupted the hierarchy of the room. He was no longer the giant looming above, dispensing knowledge from on high. He was entering her sphere. He was joining her in the trenches. Maya finally looked up. Mr. Davis wasn't frowning. He wasn't smiling that pitying smile she dreaded. His expression was serious, attentive, and incredibly calm. It was the face of a man who had seen this specific look of panic 1,000 times and knew exactly how to dismantle it. He didn't ask if she was stuck. That was obvious. He didn't ask why she wasn't working. That was accusation. Instead, he reached out and gently moved the broken pencil to the side of the desk. He pulled a spare mechanical pencil from his pocket, clicked the lead out once, and placed it near her hand. The exchange was silent, but the message was thunderous. We are not done. You are not broken. We simply need a new tool. Show me where the logic breaks, he said softly. His voice was a low rumble, meant only for her. It created a private bubble within the public space. He pointed to the second line of her attempt. You started strong here. The factoring is correct. But look at what happens when you move the negative sign. Tell me what you see. He didn't give the answer. He didn't take the pencil and write it out for her. He refused to steal the victory of understanding from her. He honored her intellect enough to demand she use it, even when she felt it had abandoned her. This is the essence of counter-storytelling in education. The standard story says the struggling student needs to be saved. The counter-story says the struggling student needs to be reminded of their own power. Mr. Davis was not a savior. He was a mirror, positioning himself so Maya could see her own capability reflected back at her. Maya looked at the negative sign. She looked at the parenthesis. The fog began to thin. The panic, which had been a roaring static in her ears, dialed down to a hum. She saw it. It was a simple distribution error. A small, careless mistake that had cascaded into a catastrophe of wrong answers. It wasn't that she didn't understand the math. It was that the anxiety had blinded her to the details. She picked up the new pencil. The weight of it felt different. Lighter. She wrote the next line. She looked at Mr. Davis. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of the chin. Keep going, he whispered. And she did. She moved to the next step and the next. The logic flowed like water finding a channel. The knots in her stomach began to loosen. When she wrote the final answer, circled it, and looked up, the transformation was total. Her face wasn't just relieved, it was illuminated. That moment, that shift from the dark claustrophobia of confusion to the bright expanse of comprehension, is the hook upon which this entire series hangs. It is the micro-incident that reveals the macro-truth. Because what happened in those 5 minutes was not just about quadratic equations. It was about the dismantling of the black tax. It was about a teacher who understood that for a student like Maya, the barrier isn't always cognitive. Sometimes it is emotional, historical, and systemic. Mr. Davis didn't just teach math. He taught resilience. He taught her that the struggle is not an indictment of her character, but a necessary step in the acquisition of mastery. He validated her right to be in that room, to struggle and to overcome, without it becoming a tragedy. This incident opens a loop that we will spend the next 45 minutes closing. It raises 3 critical questions that act as the pillars of our narrative. First, how does the pressure of representation distort the learning process? This is the defense of excellence. Second, How do students navigate the linguistic and cultural shifts required to thrive in academic spaces? This is the art of code switching. And third, what is the role of the elder, the guide, in bridging the gap between potential and kinetic energy? This is the story of the mentor. As we watch Maya turn the page and tackle the next problem with a renewed, fierce focus, we understand that we are watching a battle for the soul. The classroom is the arena. The pencil is the weapon. And the victory is the quiet, dignified realization that she is, and always has been, enough. The camera lingers on her hand, steady now, moving across the page. The hum of the air conditioner is no longer an oppressive noise, it is just background. The silence is no longer heavy, it is peaceful. She is working. She is learning. And for the first time in 20 minutes, she is breathing. The fluorescent lights hummed a lobe flat, a constant, electric drone that seemed to vibrate against the base of Maya's skull, synchronizing with the rapid, anxious thumping of her heart. In the ecosystem of a high school classroom, silence is rarely empty. It is usually heavy, filled with the scratching of graphite against paper, the shifting of bodies in plastic chairs, and the unspoken hierarchy of comprehension. For Maya, staring down at the quadratic equation that seemed to be actively resisting her attempts to solve it, the silence was not peaceful. It was accusatory. The variables on the page were not just numbers and letters, they were gatekeepers. She felt the familiar heat rising in her neck, that distinct physiological response to a threat that wasn't physical but existential. This is the moment where the air becomes thin. This is the moment where the classroom walls seem to shrink, pressing in with the weight of expectation. To the casual observer, perhaps a student glancing over from the next row, she simply looked stuck on a math problem. But inside the architecture of her thoughts, a much louder, more chaotic conversation was taking place. This is the invisible narrative that runs parallel to the curriculum. It is the quiet, devastating calculation that happens before a student of color even lifts their pencil. It is the fear that a wrong answer is not just a mathematical error, but a sociological confirmation. We call this the black tax. In the economic world, a tax is a compulsory contribution to state revenue. In the landscape of the psychology of the marginalized, the black tax is the cognitive levy placed on excellence. It is the extra energy required to navigate a space where you feel you do not inherently belong. It is the exhaustion of being a representative for an entire demographic while simply trying to find the value of X. Maya was not just trying to solve for X, she was trying to solve for her right to be in the room. She was battling the stereotype threat, the psychological predicament where a person feels at risk of confirming a negative stereotype about their social group. Every hesitation felt like a failure of her race. Every erased line felt like a betrayal of the sacrifices made by those who fought for her to have this desk, this book, this opportunity. This is the tension that turns a simple second-period math quiz into a referendum on worthiness. It creates a fog, a mental static that blocks access to the very intelligence the student possesses. The answer is there, locked behind a door of anxiety. And this is where the story usually ends, with the student shutting down, the paper remaining blank, and the potential slowly leaking out of the room like air from a punctured tire. But this story is different. This story operates on the principles of counter-storytelling. We are here to dismantle the deficit narrative. We are here to look at what happens when that tension is met not with judgment, but with a profound, precise intervention. To understand how we move from this paralyzing tension to the liberation of the mind, we must open 3 specific loops. We must explore 3 distinct lessons that will guide us through this series. First, we must understand the mechanics of the burden itself, the weight Maya is carrying right now. Second, we must study the art of the mask, the defense mechanism known as code switching, and how one learns to speak 2 languages, one for the streets and one for the syllabus. And third, and perhaps most importantly, we must examine the role of the elder, the guide who bridges the gap between history and the future. This is the lesson of the mentor. These are the 3 pillars we will climb. But right now, in this suspended moment of frustration, the only pillar that matters is the man walking down the aisle between the desks. He is moving with a slow, deliberate cadence, his presence signaling a shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. Mr. Davis did not rush. A younger teacher might have hurried over, eager to fix, eager to correct, inadvertently confirming the student's helplessness. But Mr. Davis moved with the gravity of someone who understands that teaching is not about filling a bucket, but lighting a fire. He wore a cardigan that had seen better days, and his glasses sat perched on the bridge of a nose that had smelled the tear gas of 1968 and the chalk dust of 1,000 classrooms since. He saw Maya. He didn't just see a struggling student, he saw the tax she was paying. He saw the furrowed brow, the white-knuckled grip on the yellow pencil, the way her shoulders had climbed up toward her ears in a defensive posture. He knew the signs. He knew that she wasn't fighting the math, she was fighting the narrative. He approached her desk not from the front, where he would loom over her like a judge, but from the side, pulling up a spare chair to lower his eye level to hers. This simple physical adjustment disrupted the power dynamic. He was no longer the authority figure demanding an answer. He was a fellow traveler looking at the map. He did not speak immediately. He let his presence settle the air around her, acting as a human shield against the perceived judgment of the rest of the class. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, audible only to her, stripping away the public performance of the classroom. He didn't ask, "What is the answer?" Nor did he ask, "Why don't you get it?" Those questions reinforce the deficit. Instead, he tapped the paper gently with his own finger, right next to where she had stopped working. He asked, "Tell me what the numbers are saying to you." It was a reframing. It humanized the abstract. It invited her to speak her confusion without shame. Maya hesitated. The black tax demands perfection, and she was afraid to show her messy, incomplete thinking. She looked at him, searching his face for a hint of impatience, for that inevitable flicker of disappointment she had seen in so many other eyes. But she found none. She found only a patient, expectant curiosity. He wasn't waiting for her to fail, he was waiting for her to succeed. Slowly, the grip on her pencil loosened. She exhaled, a breath she felt she had been holding since the bell rang. She pointed to the quadratic formula. She whispered that she didn't know where the negative sign went. It was a small thing, a tiny detail, but it was the snag that had unraveled her confidence. Mr. Davis nodded, not with condescension, but with recognition. He didn't just give her the rule. He told her a story about the negative sign, giving it a character, a function, a reason for being there. He turned the abstract rule into a narrative logic. And then, he asked the guiding question that changed the trajectory of the morning. He asked, "If this number represents a debt, and you subtract a debt, what happens to your fortune?" The metaphor clicked. It bypassed the anxiety and went straight to her logic centers. The fog of the black tax began to lift, not because the math got easier, but because the threat was removed. The teacher had created a safety zone, a bubble of psychological safety where it was okay to be in process, where it was okay to not know yet. This is the critical juncture. This is where the tension breaks. It is the aha moment, but not the cinematic version with swelling music. It is a quiet, internal click. Maya's eyes widened, just a fraction. The furrow in her brow smoothed out. She looked from Mr. Davis to the paper, and the variables were no longer enemies, they were just puzzle pieces. She wrote the next line of the equation. Then the next. Her hand moved with a new rhythm, a rhythm dictated by understanding rather than panic. Mr. Davis didn't praise her excessively, he didn't make a scene. He simply watched her work for another moment, nodded once, solid and affirming, and then stood up to circulate the room again. He left her with her dignity intact. He left her with the victory. He didn't solve the problem for her. He removed the obstacle that was preventing her from solving it herself. He paid the tax so she didn't have to. As Maya circled the final answer, the sensation was profound. It wasn't just relief, it was empowerment. The air conditioner hummed, but it was no longer oppressive. The scratching of pencils was no longer the sound of competition, it was just the sound of work. She sat up straighter. The invisible backpack of representation, the fear of the stereotype, had been set down, if only for this period. She had navigated the minefield. She had looked the challenge in the face and realized that with the right guide, with the right perspective, she was more than capable. The tension that had opened the scene, the high-wire act of academic performance while black, had been resolved not by lowering the standard, but by raising the support. The open loop of the mentor had begun to close, revealing the first truth of our series. Excellence is not a solo sport. It is a lineage. And as Maya turned the page to the next problem, she wasn't just a student doing math. She was a young woman reclaiming her intellectual territory, one integer at a time. The fluorescent hum of the classroom lights seemed to synchronize with the throbbing behind her temples, a low-frequency drone that only she appeared to hear. It was the distinct, sterilized silence of second period, a time of day when the morning coffee had worn off for the adults and the lunch break anticipation had not yet set in for the students. In this suspended animation, the graphite of 20 pencils scratching against paper sounded like a scurrying army of beetles. She sat near the window, but the view offered no escape, only the rigid geometry of the brick building across the courtyard. On her desk lay the textbook, open to page 42, presenting a quadratic equation that felt less like a mathematical challenge and more like a locked gate she had no key for. The numbers swam in her vision, detaching themselves from their logical anchors and floating in a murky sea of confusion. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, trying to reset her focus, but the gray fog of incomprehension only thickened. This was not just about not knowing the answer. This was the precipice of the spiral. To understand the gravity of this silence, we must examine the mechanism she had been building since kindergarten. In the architecture of her survival, there existed a dial. We call it the internal volume knob. For a young black girl in a space of academic rigor, particularly one where she is a minority, this dial is rarely left on autopilot. It is manually adjusted, second by second. Too loud, and she is labeled disruptive or aggressive. Too quiet, and she is dismissed as disengaged or slow. The setting must be perfect, constantly calibrated against the ambient noise of the room. When frustration hits, as it did now with the stubborn quadratic formula, the natural human reaction is to groan, to slam the pencil, to slump in the chair. But her internal volume knob was set to a strict limitation. She could not afford the luxury of visible frustration. To express anger at the math was to risk being perceived as angry at the world, a stereotype that waited in the corners of the room like a shadow. So, she clamped down. She internalized the scream. The volume on the outside was 0, but the volume on the inside was deafening. She looked around the room, a subtle movement of her eyes while her head remained fixed on the book. To her left, a boy was breezing through the problems, his leg bouncing with the casual rhythm of confidence. To her right, 2 girls whispered about the weekend, their worksheets already filled with neat, confident rows of numbers. The contrast burned. It reinforced the insidious narrative that had been whispered to her by society, by media, by the subtle glances of strangers, that perhaps this language of logic and structure did not belong to her. The panic began to rise, not as a wave, but as a tightening of the chest. The equation on the paper seemed to mock her, a jumble of letters and exponents that refused to yield their secrets. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks, the precursor to tears she absolutely refused to shed. The internal volume knob was vibrating now, struggling to contain the pressure building behind the facade of the quiet, struggling student. It was then that the shadow fell across her desk. It was not a looming, threatening shadow, but a soft interruption of the harsh, overhead light. Mr. Davis had been circulating the room, his presence usually marked by the squeak of his orthopedic shoes and the smell of dry erase markers and old coffee. He paused at her station. A teacher who operates only on the surface would have asked, "Do you have the answer yet?" Or perhaps offered a generic, "Keep trying." But Mr. Davis was operating on the counter-story frequency. He did not look at the paper immediately. He looked at her. He saw the white knuckles gripping the pencil. He saw the slight tremor in her jaw. He recognized the symptoms of the internal volume knob being turned to the maximum setting of restraint. He crouched down. This physical lowering of his stature was the first signal of safety. He brought his eye line level with hers, dismantling the hierarchy of the classroom. He did not speak to the class, He spoke only to the 2 feet of space between them. He lowered his voice to a register that lived below the ambient scratching of pencils, a tone that required her to lean in slightly, pulling her out of her internal spiral and into a shared, private reality. He did not ask about the math. He asked about the breathing. "Take a second," he whispered, the sound rough but warm. "Just a second. Let the noise settle." It was a permission slip she didn't know she needed. He waited. He did not rush to the solution. He waited for her to exhale, for the shoulders to drop half an inch, for the internal volume knob to be dialed down from panic to alertness. Once the physiological alarm bells were silenced, he turned his attention to the enemy on the page. He did not take the pencil from her hand. This is a crucial distinction. To take the pencil is to take the agency. To solve the problem for her is to confirm her helplessness. Instead, he pointed to the first term of the equation with his own finger, a calloused, ink-stained guide. "Talk to me," he murmured. "What is this asking us to find?" He wasn't testing her, he was inviting her to narrate her own logic. She hesitated, her voice cracking on the first syllable. She whispered a tentative answer, bracing for the correction, for the confirmation of her inadequacy. But Mr. Davis just nodded. A slow, rhythmic nod. And then he prompted. He was building a bridge, plank by plank, over the chasm of her doubt. She began to speak more clearly. She identified the variables. She recalled the rule for isolation. With every correct step, Mr. Davis offered a quiet affirmation, a hum of agreement, a tap on the desk. He was not teaching her math in this moment. He was teaching her that her mind was a valid instrument. He was adjusting the calibration of the room to fit her, rather than forcing her to shrink to fit the room. When she stumbled on the factorization, he didn't say no. He said, "Look at the sign again. What happens when we multiply 2 negatives?" The question was a lantern in the dark. She paused. The gears turned. The fog lifted. "Positive," she said, the word ringing with a sudden, sharp clarity. The realization wasn't just mathematical. It was emotional. The logic held. She could trust the rules. She could trust her mind. The aha moment did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived with the quiet scratching of graphite as she wrote the final solution on the line. X equals 4. It was a definitive, undeniable fact. She looked up at Mr. Davis, and for the first time that period, the furrow in her brow smoothed out. The internal volume knob was no longer suppressing a scream, it was broadcasting a frequency of capability. Mr. Davis didn't high-five her. He didn't make a scene that would draw the eyes of the other students and highlight her struggle. He simply straightened up, the heavy fabric of his jacket rustling. "You got it," he said, his voice returning to its normal volume, signaling the end of the private consultation. "You always had it. Trust the process." As he walked away to help a student in the back row, she sat alone with the solved equation. The silence of the room was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. She looked at the next problem. It looked complex, tangled, and difficult. But the paralyzing fear was gone. She picked up her pencil, not as a weapon of defense, but as a tool of construction. She realized that the struggle was not a sign of her lack of worth, but simply a part of the work. She didn't have to code switch her frustration into invisibility, she just had to channel it into the steps. She took a breath, adjusted her internal volume to a steady hum of focus, and began to write. The numbers, once gatekeepers, were now just guests in her house. The fluorescent lights hummed with a specific frequency that seemed to target the space right between her eyes, a relentless drone that grew louder as the variables on the page blurred into nonsense. It was the specific distinct silence of a classroom where everyone else understands the language except you, a silence that feels heavy and judging, pressing against the eardrums like deep water. She stared at the quadratic formula printed in the textbook, the black ink stark against the glossy white paper, and for a moment, the symbols looked less like mathematics and more like barbed wire fencing her out of a place she was supposed to belong. The pencil in her hand felt slippery, the wood warm from her anxious grip, and she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, that familiar, stinging signal that she was about to be exposed as a fraud in the sanctuary of academia. This was not just about finding the value of X. It was about the recurring nightmare that perhaps her mind was not built for this architecture, that the logic required to dismantle these equations was a key she had never been given. She looked up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the clock without moving her head too much, terrified that any sudden movement would attract attention to her paralysis. The teacher, Mr. Vance, was moving through the aisles with the grace of a man who viewed the classroom not as a factory floor but as a garden that required specific, individual pruning. He did not rush. He did not check a watch. He moved with a devastating calmness that usually intimidated her, but today, as panic began to constrict her throat, his slow pace felt like the only anchor in a spinning room. He paused 2 rows away, correcting a posture, whispering a hint, and she saw him not just as an authority figure but as a monolith of knowledge, towering and inaccessible. She dropped her gaze back to the paper, the shame burning hot now. She was going to fail, and in her mind, failure was not just a grade. It was a betrayal of every sacrifice made to get her into this chair, in this room, with this book. Then, the shadow fell across her desk. It was not a looming, threatening shadow, but a cooling one. She stiffened, waiting for the reprimand, waiting for the loud question that would alert the other 20 students to her confusion. Instead, there was a quiet scrape of a chair being pulled up. Mr. Vance sat down. He did not tower over her. He lowered himself until his eyes were level with hers, dismantling the hierarchy of the room in a single physical motion. He looked at the blank space under question number 5, then he looked at her, and his expression held no judgment, only a deep, ancient recognition. He saw the furrow in her brow and the tension in her jaw, and suddenly, the room around them seemed to dissolve. Mr. Vance was no longer just a teacher in 2024, he was a conduit. He took a breath, and the smell of dry erase markers seemed to shift into the scent of old chalk and rain-soaked wool. He looked at her and spoke, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in her chest. "I know this look," he said softly. "It is the look of someone who thinks the wall is made of concrete. But I am here to tell you it is made of paper." He tapped the page with a long, steady finger. When he looked at her, he didn't just see a struggling student. He saw a lineage. He saw the history of this moment, echoing back through decades of classrooms where students like her had been told they did not belong. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, and in that darkness, he went back. He went back to 1968. The memory washed over him with the force of a physical blow. He was 12 years old, sitting in a portable classroom that smelled of mildew and heat, the air thick with the humidity of a southern September. The desks were mismatched, scarred with the initials of boys who had been drafted or forgotten. At the front of that room stood Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis wore a suit every single day, no matter the heat, his tie knotted with geometric precision, his shoes polished to a mirror shine that reflected the cracked linoleum. Mr. Davis did not teach math as a requirement, he taught it as a weapon. Mr. Vance remembered the way Mr. Davis would hold a piece of chalk like a baton, slamming it against the slate to emphasize a theorem. He remembered the feeling of being small and black and poor in a world that wanted him to stay that way, and staring at a calculus problem that felt like an alien language. He remembered the despair, the exact same despair he now saw in the girl sitting before him. He remembered Mr. Davis walking down the aisle, the sound of his hard-soled shoes clicking a rhythm of defiance. Mr. Davis had leaned down, just as Mr. Vance was leaning now, and whispered the words that had changed the trajectory of his life. He told him that mathematics was the language of the universe, and that the universe did not discriminate. He told him that solving for X was an act of liberation. He said that when you control the numbers, you control the narrative. Mr. Davis had taken the fear out of the equation and replaced it with purpose. He had shown the young Mr. Vance that the struggle was not a sign of inferiority, but the friction of growth. Now, 50 years later, Mr. Vance opened his eyes and looked at the girl. He was the bridge. The link had to hold. He picked up a pencil, not taking it from her, but picking up his own, placing it parallel to hers on the desk. He did not give her the answer. He did not simplify the problem to the point of insult. Instead, He asked her a question that Mr. Davis had asked him. He asked her what she saw. Not what she thought the answer was, but what the numbers were doing. He narrated the problem not as a test, but as a story. He traced the arc of the parabola with the tip of the pencil, showing her the symmetry, the balance, the inevitability of the solution. He spoke to her about the logic, about how the equation was just a sentence waiting to be read. He watched as her breathing slowed. He watched as the panic began to recede, replaced by a tentative curiosity. This was the intergenerational transmission of excellence. It was not written in the curriculum. It was not captured in standardized tests. It was the silent, holy work of passing the torch. He saw her eyes flicker with understanding, that precious, sudden spark where the connection is made. The tension in her hand relaxed. She erased the scribbles of her frustration and began to write again, this time with intention. Mr. Vance stayed there for a moment longer, watching the graphite bite into the paper. He thought of Mr. Davis, long gone now, buried in a segregated cemetery under an oak tree. He thought of the suit, the heat, the chalk dust. He realized that Mr. Davis was in this room right now, living through his hands, speaking through his voice. The girl solved the step. She looked up at him, and her smile was small, hesitant, but real. It was a smile of ownership. She had claimed the knowledge. She had stepped into the stream. Mr. Vance nodded, a small, imperceptible dipping of his chin. "That is it," he whispered. "You are speaking the language now." He stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and the magic circle broke, returning them to the bustling reality of the second period. But the transaction was complete. He walked away, back toward the front of the room, his heart full of a quiet, fierce pride. He had paid the debt. He had kept the line unbroken. The graphite marks on the page were no longer just scratches of frustration but had transformed into the elegant architecture of logic, standing stark and undeniable against the white paper. There is a specific weight to a solved equation, a gravitational pull that differs entirely from the floating anxiety of the unknown. The girl looked down at the paper, her eyes tracing the steps that Mr. Vance had helped her excavate from the chaos of her own mind. It was done. The variable was isolated. The value was found. This piece of paper was now more than just homework. It was evidence. In the parlance of the streets and the boardrooms alike, she had the receipts. The moral victory here was not merely in getting the right answer, for answers can be guessed or copied. The victory was in the undeniable proof of process. She had faced the wall of incomprehension, that silent monolith that tells marginalized students they do not belong in the halls of higher mathematics, and she had dismantled it brick by brick. The silence in the room seemed to change texture again, shifting from the heavy oppression of the earlier minutes to a crisp, clear atmosphere of resolution. She did not look around for approval from her peers. She did not seek a gold star. She stared at the number at the bottom of the page, recognizing it as a reflection of her own capacity. This is the essence of the receipts. It is the documentation of worth in a world that often demands a deposit before it allows you to enter the room. Mr. Vance remained standing near the front of the rows, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. He understood the magnitude of what had just transpired better than anyone else in the room. He knew that for this student, the math problem was a proxy war. It was never just about X and Y. It was about the narrative that had been written for her before she was even born, a narrative of deficit and struggle. By guiding her to the solution without handling it to her, he had allowed her to rewrite that sentence. He watched her posture shift. The slump of defeat was gone, replaced by a straightening of the spine that comes from competency. She picked up her pencil, not as a weapon of defense, but as a tool of construction, and moved to the next problem. This action was the true receipt. It was the decision to continue. The fear had evaporated, burned away by the light of understanding. Mr. Vance saw the other students glancing over. They had seen the struggle, yes, but now they were witnessing the recovery. They saw that she was not a sinking ship, but a vessel that had simply needed to adjust its sails. The social hierarchy of a second-period classroom is brutal and swift, often relegating the struggling student to the bottom rung. But the receipt of competence is a powerful currency. It buys respect. It buys space. The concept of the black tax suggests that one must work twice as hard to get half as far, that one must constantly prove their right to exist in professional and academic spaces. Today, in this quiet corner of the school, the tax had been paid in full. The receipts were filed. The girl circled the final answer with a deliberate, firm motion. That circle was a boundary line. It marked the territory she had conquered. It is important to understand that this moral victory is internal. It does not depend on the applause of the audience. The world outside might still look at her with skepticism. The statistics might still bet against her. But she carried now, in the pocket of her mind, the undeniable memory of this triumph. She knew that the logic of mathematics did not discriminate. The numbers did not care about her zip code or her background. They only cared about the truth. And she had spoken the truth. This alignment with objective reality is the ultimate shield against gaslighting. When the world tries to tell you that you are not capable, you can look at the receipts. You can look at the work you have done, the problems you have solved, the mountains you have climbed. The bell rang, a shrill interruption that shattered the concentration of the room. Usually, this sound would be a salvation, a release from the prison of the desk. But today, it was merely punctuation. The girl closed her book slowly. There was no rush to escape, because she was no longer escaping a scene of a crime. She was departing a scene of victory. She gathered her things with a methodical calmness. Mr. Vance stood by the door as the students filed out, a stream of chatter and movement. When the girl approached, she did not stop, and he did not offer grand praise. To praise her excessively would be to imply that her success was a surprise, an anomaly. Instead, he simply met her eyes. It was a look of professional acknowledgement. It was a look that said, "I expected nothing less." She nodded, a microscopic movement of the head, clutching her notebook to her chest. In that notebook lay the receipts. She walked out of the door and into the chaotic hallway, the noise of the school swallowing her up. But she moved differently now. She cut through the crowd with the momentum of someone who knows exactly where they are going. She was not just a student passing through the system. She was a mathematician who had balanced the equation. The moral victory was secured, not in the grade book, but in the quiet, fortress-like certainty of her own mind. The heavy metal doors of the school swung shut behind her with a finality that echoed like a gavel striking a sound block, sealing the chaotic energy of the hallway inside while she stepped into the crisp, indifferent air of the afternoon. The world outside looked identical to how it had appeared that morning, yet the lens through which she viewed it had fundamentally altered. The concrete beneath her sneakers was no longer just pavement, but a surface governed by friction coefficients and geometric planes. The power lines sagging above the street were not just ugly wires, but catenary curves describing the elegant relationship between tension and gravity. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, which felt lighter now, not because the books had lost their mass, but because the invisible weight of incompetence she had been carrying all semester had finally been discarded. This is the first movement of the final lesson, a realization that happens in the quiet moments between the event and the recounting of it. The lesson was never really about the quadratic formula or the isolation of a variable. Those were merely the delivery mechanisms for a much more potent curriculum. Mr. Davis had not just taught her how to solve a math problem. He had taught her how to survive an environment designed to question her cognitive capacity. As she walked toward the bus stop, the noise of the city seemed to dampen, pushed to the periphery of her awareness. She was inhabiting a new mental fortress, one constructed from the sturdy bricks of proven ability. The bus ride home offered a transitional space, a mobile limbo where the events of the second period could be dissected and filed away into the archives of her character. She sat near the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of gray and brick red. Usually, this ride was a time for anxiety, a time to worry about the homework she did not understand or the scrutiny she would face the next day. Today, however, the anxiety was replaced by a simmering, quiet rage that was slowly cooling into a hard resolve. This is a critical distinction in the counter-storytelling framework. We often depict the moment of triumph as one of pure joy, a cinematic release of tension accompanied by swelling music. But for the student navigating the complexities of the black tax, the feeling is often more complicated. It is a feeling of validation mixed with exhaustion. She realized, watching the telephone poles rhythmically slice through her field of vision, that she had spent weeks feeling inadequate because the system had not provided her with the translation key. Mr. Davis had not lowered the standard. He had simply handed her the key. The rage came from the understanding of how easily that key could have been withheld. How many others were sitting in classrooms across the city, feeling the crushing weight of stupidity, simply because no one had taken the 45 seconds to bridge the gap between their cultural context and the academic language. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. She was not a charity case. She was an intellectual engine that had finally been given the correct fuel. Upon entering the small, dimly lit kitchen of her apartment, the atmosphere shifted from the theoretical to the domestic. Her grandmother was at the stove, the air thick with the smell of onions and paprika. In a traditional narrative, this would be the moment the student runs in, waving the paper, shouting about her success. But the counter-story operates in the nuances of silence and dignity. She did not shout. She simply walked to the kitchen table, unzipped her bag, and placed the math notebook on the formica surface. The sound it made was solid and heavy. She opened it to the page where the receipts were kept, the page covered in the graphite evidence of her struggle and her victory. She sat down and began to work on the next set of problems. Her grandmother turned, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and looked at the girl. The graphite marks on the page were no longer just scratches of frustration but had transformed into the elegant architecture of logic, standing stark and undeniable against the white paper. There is a specific weight to a solved equation, a gravitational pull that differs entirely from the floating anxiety of the unknown. The girl looked down at the paper, her eyes tracing the steps that Mr. Vance had helped her excavate from the chaos of her own mind. It was done. The variable was isolated. The value was found. This piece of paper was now more than just homework. It was evidence. In the parlance of the streets and the boardrooms alike, she had the receipts. The moral victory here was not merely in getting the right answer, for answers can be guessed or copied. The victory was in the undeniable proof of process. She had faced the wall of incomprehension, that silent monolith that tells marginalized students they do not belong in the halls of higher mathematics, and she had dismantled it brick by brick. The silence in the room seemed to change texture again, shifting from the heavy oppression of the earlier minutes to a crisp, clear atmosphere of resolution. She did not look around for approval from her peers. She did not seek a gold star. She stared at the number at the bottom of the page, recognizing it as a reflection of her own capacity. This is the essence of the receipts. It is the documentation of worth in a world that often demands a deposit before it allows you to enter the room. Mr. Vance remained standing near the front of the rows, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. He understood the magnitude of what had just transpired better than anyone else in the room. He knew that for this student, the math problem was a proxy war. It was never just about X and Y. It was about the narrative that had been written for her before she was even born, a narrative of deficit and struggle. By guiding her to the solution without handling it to her, he had allowed her to rewrite that sentence. He watched her posture shift. The slump of defeat was gone, replaced by a straightening of the spine that comes from competency. She picked up her pencil, not as a weapon of defense, but as a tool of construction, and moved to the next problem. This action was the true receipt. It was the decision to continue. The fear had evaporated, burned away by the light of understanding. Mr. Vance saw the other students glancing over. They had seen the struggle, yes, but now they were witnessing the recovery. They saw that she was not a sinking ship, but a vessel that had simply needed to adjust its sails. The social hierarchy of a second-period classroom is brutal and swift, often relegating the struggling student to the bottom rung. But the receipt of competence is a powerful currency. It buys respect. It buys space. The concept of the black tax suggests that one must work twice as hard to get half as far, that one must constantly prove their right to exist in professional and academic spaces. Today, in this quiet corner of the school, the tax had been paid in full. The receipts were filed. The girl circled the final answer with a deliberate, firm motion. That circle was a boundary line. It marked the territory she had conquered. It is important to understand that this moral victory is internal. It does not depend on the applause of the audience. The world outside might still look at her with skepticism. The statistics might still bet against her. But she carried now, in the pocket of her mind, the undeniable memory of this triumph. She knew that the logic of mathematics did not discriminate. The numbers did not care about her zip code or her background. They only cared about the truth. And she had spoken the truth. This alignment with objective reality is the ultimate shield against gaslighting. When the world tries to tell you that you are not capable, you can look at the receipts. You can look at the work you have done, the problems you have solved, the mountains you have climbed. The bell rang, a shrill interruption that shattered the concentration of the room. Usually, this sound would be a salvation, a release from the prison of the desk. But today, it was merely punctuation. The girl closed her book slowly. There was no rush to escape, because she was no longer escaping a scene of a crime. She was departing a scene of victory. She gathered her things with a methodical calmness. Mr. Vance stood by the door as the students filed out, a stream of chatter and movement. When the girl approached, she did not stop, and he did not offer grand praise. To praise her excessively would be to imply that her success was a surprise, an anomaly. Instead, he simply met her eyes. It was a look of professional acknowledgement. It was a look that said, "I expected nothing less." She nodded, a microscopic movement of the head, clutching her notebook to her chest. In that notebook lay the receipts. She walked out of the door and into the chaotic hallway, the noise of the school swallowing her up. But she moved differently now. She cut through the crowd with the momentum of someone who knows exactly where they are going. She was not just a student passing through the system. She was a mathematician who had balanced the equation. The moral victory was secured, not in the grade book, but in the quiet, fortress-like certainty of her own mind.